"Hey." She heard her name called from about 60 yards off trail, uphill, through dense rhododendron, in the dark. The voice was clear enough that she stopped walking, clear enough that she turned toward it. Her hiking partner was behind her on the trail. She had passed him less than 4 minutes earlier. He had not moved. The AT shelter they were headed for was another 1.5 miles out. No signal. The nearest road crossing was 8 miles back. She finished that section. She has not hiked alone since. Here is how that night started. She had planned the trip for months. 4 days on a section of the Appalachian Trail through the Smokies, late October, after the leaf peepers had gone home, and before the first hard freeze pushed everyone out. She had done sections like this before, not this exact stretch, but enough similar ones that she knew what to pack, what to leave behind, and how to read weather coming off a ridge. She carried a paper map because she had learned years ago that phone GPS in the Smokies is unreliable past the second or third ridge, and she marked her water sources in pencil before she left the car. She set out before 7 in the morning. The trailhead parking area held 2 other vehicles. Both had the look of day hikers, light packs and clean boots waiting by the tailgates. She nodded to them, signed the register at the kiosk, and started walking. By noon, she had passed those 2 heading back out, and after that she was alone. The trail in that section runs narrow. The rhododendron grows thick on both sides, shoulder height in places, close enough that a pack brushes the branches when the switchbacks tighten. In late October, the leaves hold on longer than you expect, and the canopy above them was still dense enough to hold mist. Fog had been settling into the gaps since mid-morning, not thick enough to reduce visibility to anything dangerous, but present. A soft gray pressure at the edges of the trail that made distances feel uncertain. She stopped at a creek crossing around 2 in the afternoon. Took off her pack, filled her water bottle, ran it through her filter while she sat on a mossy log and ate a granola bar. The wrapper made a sharp crackling sound in the quiet. She noted the time in her trail journal, checked the map, confirmed the shelter was 4 miles out, and adjusted her pack straps before she started again. Practical things. The kind of things she did on every trip in that order, because routine is what keeps you from making mistakes when you're tired. Her signal had dropped around mile marker 4. She had expected that. She did not check her phone again after that point because there was no reason to. Nobody was expecting her for 4 days. She heard the whistle about 40 minutes after the creek crossing. 2 notes descending. Not a bird call. She knew the birds up there, had the Merlin app for the ones she didn't recognize, and this wasn't any of them. It came from uphill, off to her left, somewhere in the rhododendron above the trail. She slowed but didn't stop. Could have been another hiker cutting a switchback, she thought. Some people do that, especially locals who know the terrain. The sound carried strangely up here. She'd noticed that before, how a voice or a sound could bounce off a ridge face and land 20 yards from where it originated. She kept walking. 20 minutes later, she heard it again. Same 2 notes. Same direction, uphill and left. She had walked nearly a mile since the first one. She stopped this time, turned her head, listened. Nothing else. Just the rhododendron leaves against each other in the light wind, and that particular wetwood smell that comes off the mountains in October when the rain has been heavy. Then the whistle stopped. Not faded. Stopped. She realized only as she stopped walking that the whistle had also stopped the moment she did. She stood still for what felt like a full minute. Nothing came back. She told herself it was an echo effect, some quirk of the ridge. She told herself she was tired and reading too much into timing. She put one boot in front of the other and kept going. The shelter appeared through the trees at dusk, just as the light was dropping below Usable. A three-sided lean-to, the standard AT design. Open front, sleeping platform raised off the ground. A bear cable strung between two trees at the side. She came up the short spur trail to it and stood for a moment taking it in. Empty. No other packs, no gear, no sign of anyone recent. She hung her food bag on the cable, set up her sleeping pad on the platform, and lit her small camp stove to heat water for dinner. The register was mounted in a box on one of the side walls. She flipped it open with the habit she had on every shelter visit, scanning the last few entries. The most recent was 3 days old. A group of 4 who had signed in heading south. Below that, nothing. She signed her own entry, her trail name, her direction, and the date. She was the only one who had signed in today. That was not unusual. It was a weekday in late October. Most people were not out here. She told herself that too, and she believed it. And she ate her dinner and washed out her pot with a little water and tucked herself into her sleeping bag while the last light died in the gaps between the trees below the shelter. She was almost asleep when the whistle came back. This time it was not uphill. Not from the ridge above the shelter where she might have explained it again as another hiker, a ridge echo, something reasonable. It was level. It came from the flat below the shelter, from somewhere inside the tree line at the bottom of the small clearing. 2 notes descending, the same as before. She lay still and listened with her eyes open in the dark. The shelter had no door. That was the thing she kept coming back to. 3 walls, a roof, an open front, and 8 feet of empty air between the edge of the sleeping platform and the tree line on the downhill side. Whatever was making that sound was standing somewhere in the trees below her, and there was nothing between them but dark air and a few feet of open ground. She did not move. She did not reach for her headlamp. The sound moved. That was the part she described in her submission as the moment things changed. Not the whistle itself, but the movement. It traveled slowly left along the tree line, maybe 40 feet, and then stopped. She counted her breaths while she waited. 12, 13, 14. Nothing came back. The woods were quiet in the specific way woods go quiet when the wind drops, and there are no other animals moving. A quiet that feels less like peace and more like attention. She reached for her headlamp, turned it on, swept the beam across the clearing in front of the shelter, across the tree line below, along the edge of the wood. The beam was weak. She had not changed the batteries before this trip, a thing she would not forget again. The light reached maybe 20 feet into the dark. Beyond that, just shapes, trees, the suggestion of undergrowth. Nothing visible, no eyeshine, no silhouette. She turned the headlamp off. It was only later, packing up in the morning, that she remembered what the hostel owner had told her 3 days earlier in the last trail town before this section. She had spent one night there, a bunk in a 6-person room, and the woman who ran the place had been in the kitchen when she came down for coffee. An older woman, heavy-set, practical, not the type who told scary stories for entertainment. She had asked where the section hiker was headed, listened to the answer, and then said, without looking up from the coffee she was pouring, "Don't whistle back at something you can't see, especially not after it's moved twice." At the time, it had seemed like the kind of regional caution people picked up and passed along without much thought behind it. The trail version of "Don't feed the bears," something said so often it lost its edge. She had smiled and said she wouldn't, and she had not thought about it again. Until now. She had not whistled back. That was something. But she had turned on her headlamp. She had moved. She had announced herself. Whether that was better or worse than a whistle, she did not know. The rain started around midnight. She heard it coming before it arrived. That soft building hiss in the canopy that means rain is moving through the trees from a distance, traveling down toward you. Then it hit the metal roof of the shelter and the whole world became that sound. Heavy, steady, drumming on the tin above her head. The creak below the shelter, which she had barely heard since arriving, came up in volume suddenly, audible even over the rain. She thought about leaving. For a moment, she genuinely thought about packing up in the dark and hiking out. 11 miles to the nearest road crossing in rain, with weak headlamp batteries, on a narrow trail through rhododendron. She ran the math on it, and the math said no. The rain was loud enough that she could not hear anything outside it, which meant she could not hear footsteps, which meant whatever she had been listening to was now invisible and inaudible both. That did not make her feel better. She pulled her sleeping bag up and sat with her back against the rear wall of the shelter and her knees bent and her headlamp in her hand. She did not turn it on, she just held it. She would say later that she heard the whistle one more time, a third repetition from directly in front of the shelter, from the open clearing between the tree line and the overhang, maybe 20 feet out. Not uphill, not along the tree line, in front. In the rain, in the dark, in the open. She did not respond, she did not move. She sat with her back against that wall for what she believed was somewhere between an hour and 2 hours. She could not check the time because checking the time required moving, and moving felt wrong. At some point, she became aware that her headlamp was off and she had no memory of turning it off. She had been holding it, she remembered holding it. And then she was not holding it, and it was off, and it was on the platform next to her sleeping bag where she must have set it down. But she did not remember doing that. She did not sleep. The rain let up around 4 in the morning. She sat in the gray quiet that followed it and waited for light to start in the gaps between the trees. And when it did, she stood up stiffly and packed her bag in the first pale gray of dawn without eating, without heating water, stuffing things in wrong order and correcting as she went. She looked at the clearing in front of the shelter before she shouldered her pack. The ground out there was soft from the rain, a thin layer of mud over the red clay of the Smokies, the kind of surface that holds a mark easily. She walked to the edge of the overhang and looked out. There were 2 parallel lines in the mud, starting about 8 feet from the shelter's edge and running toward it, stopping exactly at the drip line of the roof, the point where rain falls off the edge and hits the ground. Each line was roughly 8 inches wide, separated from the other by about 2 feet. They were not boot prints. They were not the spread-toed mark of any animal she knew. They were drag marks, or something like drag marks, as if 2 parallel things had been drawn through the mud from the tree line to the shelter's edge, slowly, stopping precisely at the point where the roof ended, and anything standing there would have been protected from the rain. There was nothing on the other side of those marks. No prints leading away, no disturbance in the mud facing outward. Whatever had made them had arrived at the shelter's edge and stopped. She stood looking at them for a long moment. Then she hiked out. She did the full 11 miles to the road's crossing before noon, moving faster than she had moved in years, and she sat in her car in the parking lot for 40 minutes before she started the engine. She did not take a photograph of the marks. She thought about it and did not do it. She said in her submission that she did not want the proof. She wanted to be able to tell herself it had been something else. She has not been able to. She still hikes. But she does not hike alone anymore, and she carries fresh batteries for her headlamp the way some people carry a spare key. Not for convenience, but because she cannot not carry them. And she has never whistled on trail after dark. Not once. Not even to signal a partner who was close. She said she was not sure she could explain that fully, and she did not try. That account came from the Smokies. The next one is from Central Virginia. Different terrain, different people. The same pattern. The couple had been hiking together for 6 years. They were not the kind of people who spooked easily. She kept a detailed trail journal and could identify most birds by call. He had done 200 miles of the AT in sections over 4 years and had slept in shelters alone in weather that would send most people home. They were comfortable out there in the way that only comes from time, the specific ease of people who have made enough mistakes in the backcountry to know how to avoid them. They arrived at the shelter on a Friday afternoon in late September, when the hardwoods along that section of the Virginia AT were just beginning to turn. Yellow mostly, with a few early maples going orange at the edges. The light came through the canopy differently than it would in another 2 weeks. Still filtered, still green-tinged, but with that early autumn feeling of something winding down. They had done 9 miles that day and had 3 more planned for the morning. It was a good pace. They felt good. The shelter was a 2-story design, which some of the older AT shelters in Virginia still are. A sleeping platform on the lower level, a second platform accessible by a short wooden ladder on the upper level, and enough headroom on both floors for a person to sit upright but not quite stand. The spring was a short walk down a blue-blazed spur trail, marked with a piece of faded orange flagging on the last tree before the source. The water was cold and clear. He went down to fill bottles while she set up the sleeping pads on the lower platform and got the stove going. There was one other person at the shelter when they arrived, a thin man, older, somewhere in his 60s, already settled on the lower platform with his back against the side wall. He had almost no gear, a small frameless pack, very light, no sleeping bag visible, just a rolled tarp of some kind that looked older than anything sold in a gear shop in the last 20 years. He was friendly in the quiet way of experienced thru-hikers, the nod and the brief exchange that communicates, "I am not a threat," and "I am not looking for conversation," both at once. He said he was doing a flip-flop, started at Harper's Ferry and working north, planned to hit Katadine before the weather closed. He had a trail name, which she wrote in her journal that evening because she always logged the other hikers she met at shelters. She described his handwriting in the register as very small and very neat, the handwriting of someone who was careful about the space they took up. He left at dusk. That part was what stuck with them first. Not immediately, but later. He shouldered his light pack around the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, said he was going to push to the next shelter and headed north on the trail. The man checked the register after dinner, noted the entry, and remarked to her that the next shelter north was 9 miles out. Hiking 9 miles in the dark, on a trail neither of them knew in that section, was not impossible. Some people did it, but this man was older and carrying almost nothing, and 9 miles in the dark at the end of a day's hike was not a casual decision. "Maybe he's faster than he looks," she said, and they left it at that. They settled in around 8. She journaled while he read with his headlamp hanging from a nail on the shelter wall, the beam pointing at the ceiling and spreading enough light to read by. The spring gurgled somewhere down the spur trail. Somewhere in the canopy above the shelter, a branch tapped against another in the light wind. A slow, irregular knock that was easy to ignore. Their boots were lined up near the ladder to the upper level. The pasta pot was washed and packed. It was the particular kind of comfortable that comes from a full day of hard walking and a full stomach and a sleeping bag that will be warm. He was asleep by 9:30. She was still half reading, half drifting, when she heard the footsteps. They came from the upper level, slow, heavy, crossing the floor from left to right. Not the tick of an animal. These were the spaced, weighted sounds of a person walking with deliberate steps across old wooden boards. She sat up. He was already awake, she realized, sitting up beside her with his headlamp in his hand. He went up the ladder. She listened from below. She heard the creak of the boards as he moved around up there. She heard him stop. Then the ladder again, and he was back down, shaking his head. Nothing, he said. No gear, no animal. The dust on the upper floor was undisturbed. He had seen one partial boot print near the far corner. Recent, he thought, but possibly left by the last person who had slept up there. Nothing that explained what they had heard. Old shelter. Old boards. Raccoons got into these places all the time and could rattle a platform enough to sound like footsteps if you were half asleep and your brain was filling in the rest. He lay back down. She lay back down. The branch in the canopy tapped against its neighbor. The spring gurgled. 20 minutes later, the footsteps came again. Same pace. Same direction, left to right across the upper floor. The same weight behind each step, the same spacing. Both of them sat up this time without speaking. He took the ladder again. She lay on her back and stared at the underside of the upper platform and listened to him move around above her. He came down slower this time. She asked him what he found. He said the partial boot print now had a companion. A second print, a few feet from the first, facing the opposite direction. 2 prints, facing each other, as if 2 people had stood in the corner of the upper platform and faced inward toward each other. The dust around them was still otherwise undisturbed. He did not tell her that detail until a week later. He told her the upper floor was empty, that it had probably been the board settling, and he lay back down beside her, and they both did not sleep very well, and did not discuss why. It was only a week later, over dinner at home, that he described the 2 prints facing each other. And when he did, she went very quiet and then said, "I thought you made those. I heard you go up twice." He had gone up twice. The first time he had seen 1 print. The second time he had seen 2. The second print had not been there on the first trip. He had not made it. Neither of them had been on the upper level between his 2 trips up the ladder. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of September morning where the fog sits in the gaps between ridges and does not burn off until well after 9. They packed in relative quiet, not the comfortable quiet of the night before, but something more careful, a silence that both of them were maintaining without discussing why. She heated water for coffee and poured it into the thermos. He broke down the sleeping pads and stuffed them into their bags with the mechanical efficiency of someone keeping their hands busy. He checked the register before they left. He always did this, logged the date, their names, their destination, a note on trail conditions if anything was worth reporting. He flipped back through the recent entries while she packed the stove. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. She looked up. The thin man's entry was there, above theirs from the night before. Trail name, destination, and a date. The date was 2 days from now. Not yesterday when they had both watched him write in the register before he left. 2 days from now. The handwriting was the same, very small, very neat, and the entry was otherwise ordinary except for that single impossible number. Their own entry below it was correctly dated. His was not. He took a photograph of the page with his phone before they left. He did not say much about it on the trail that morning. She could tell he was turning it over, the way he got quiet when something was bothering him, and he had not yet figured out what to do with it. She did not push. They walked. About half a mile north of the shelter, she spotted it first. The pack was sitting upright against a tree on the left side of the trail, maybe 4 feet off the white blazes, in a spot where the morning light caught the pale canvas of it. Frameless, old, exactly what the thin man had been carrying. It sat perfectly upright, not leaned or tipped. Upright, as if it had been placed there with care. They stopped. He called out, asking if anyone was nearby. His voice went into the trees and did not come back with anything. They looked at it for a long moment without touching it. He finally crouched and unfolded the top flap. Inside, nothing. No food bag, no water filter, no sleeping gear, no emergency kit. The pack was empty, except for a single folded piece of paper tucked against the interior frame. He unfolded it. One sentence, written in the same small, neat hand from the register. A trail name, the same one from the entry, and below it, 2 words, "Gone ahead." They looked at each other over the canvas pack. He folded the paper and put it back and left the pack where it was. Later, he would question that decision, wonder whether he should have taken it to a ranger station or left a note of his own, or done something other than walk away. But at the time, the right move seemed unclear enough that walking felt safer than anything else. They hiked out. The next trail town was 7 miles south of where they had started that morning, accessible by a road crossing that they reached by early afternoon. There was a hostel there run by a woman in her 60s who had worked that section of the trail corridor for as long as anyone seemed to remember. The kind of person who had heard every story and seen every type of hiker and maintained a level expression through all of it. She was folding laundry when they came in, and she listened while he described the thin man, the entry in the register, the pack. She did not change her expression. She set down the shirt she was folding and picked up another one. Then she said, without looking at either of them, "He's been going ahead for a while." That was all she said. She did not explain it. He asked what she meant, and she said she had said what she meant. And she picked up another shirt, and the conversation was over in the way that some conversations in small places simply end. Not rudely, not dramatically, just closed, the way a door closes when the person on the other side has said what they came to say. They ate lunch in the hostel common room and did not talk about it. He looked up the trail name when he got home. He did not expect to find anything. The name was unusual enough. A combination of words specific enough that a search would either return nothing or return exactly one result. It returned one result. A forum post on a trail community site, a memorial thread, 43 replies. The thread was for a hiker who had gone missing on that section of the Virginia AT 11 years earlier. The case had never been officially closed. He had simply walked north one afternoon and had not been seen again, and the searches had turned up nothing usable. The trail name matched exactly. He read through the replies carefully. Several of them mentioned encounters with a thin, older man on that section, carrying almost nothing, always moving north, always calm, always leaving before dark. The descriptions were close enough that he had to stop reading and close the laptop and sit in the kitchen for a while. He went back to it the next day. A few of the replies noted the dates of the encounters, and the dates were spread across years. The same man, the same description, the same behavior, across multiple hiking seasons. He showed her the thread. She read the first 3 replies and then handed the phone back and said she did not want to know more. That was her right, and he respected it. But he kept the photograph he had taken of the register page, and when he looked at it on his cracked phone screen, the thin man's entry, the very small handwriting, the date 2 days wrong, he noticed something he had not caught in the shelter that morning. Below the trail name, below the destination, there was one more word he had missed. Faint, written smaller than the rest, almost not there. A single word below the date. He had to zoom in on the photo to read it clearly. He never posted the photograph publicly. His girlfriend asked him not to, and he agreed, and he has kept that agreement. But he has also never deleted the photo. It sits in his camera roll, somewhere in the middle of a normal year's worth of pictures, meals and family and hiking trail shots, and every few months he scrolls past it and keeps scrolling. He does not know what the word at the bottom of the entry means. He said that when the account was passed along through a trail running group where he first told the story, He said he had looked it up, and it was not a word in any language he could find, and it was not a trail term, and it was not a name. He said the most unsettling thing about it was that the handwriting on that one small word was slightly different from the rest of the entry, as if it had been added later, as if something had come back to the register after the thin man left and finished the sentence he had started. The pack is presumably still on that trail. Nobody went back to check. The hostel owner would not discuss it again when he called the following week. The forum thread has not been updated in 2 years. His girlfriend still hikes. She still does the AT in sections, still keeps her trail journal, still identifies birds by call. She has never returned to that shelter. She said once that it was simply not a section she was interested in revisiting, and she said it in the tone of someone who has decided something permanently and does not need to explain further. The couple never identified the thin man officially. The next account has a different kind of record problem, one that sits in an official log with a blank line where something should be. This account came through a retired federal land manager who spent 22 years working public lands in the Southeast. He heard it from a former seasonal ranger whose name and district have been changed. He said when he passed it along that the account matched a pattern he had heard from 3 separate rangers in 3 separate districts, none of whom knew each other, all of whom described the same sequence of events in roughly the same order. He did not speculate about what that pattern meant. He just noted it, the way a careful person notes a measurement that comes back the same 3 times from 3 different instruments. The ranger was in his early 30s at the time. 2 seasons on the same AT corridor section in Tennessee, which made him experienced enough to know the trail well, but not so seasoned that he had stopped paying attention to things that did not fit. He was the kind of person who logged everything: weather conditions, erosion measurements, blowdown locations, trail register entries, radio check-in times. He kept his clipboard dry under his jacket when it rained and transferred his field notes to the station log the same evening. He trusted systems because systems had always worked for him. That was important to understand before the rest of the account made sense. It was a Tuesday in early November, post-storm trail check. A front had moved through over the weekend, dropping 2 inches of rain and bringing wind that had taken down 3 or 4 significant trees on his section, based on the reports from the weekend volunteer crew. His job that morning was straightforward: drive the service road to the various access points, walk the worst of the affected stretches, photograph the damage, cut what he could with the chainsaw in the bed of his truck, flag what needed a crew. He had done this route a dozen times. He knew where the problem trees were likely to fall, knew which switchbacks collected the worst erosion, knew every gate and culvert and trailhead kiosk on his 20-mile section by feel. He started at the south end and worked north. The chainsaw came out twice in the first 3 miles, a pine across the trail above the first switchback, and a smaller hardwood that had come down on the drainage ditch and was backing up water onto the tread. Standard work. He photographed the erosion at the creek crossing, noted 2 trail markers that needed replacing on his clipboard, made his first radio check-in at 9:15. Dispatch acknowledged. Everything normal. He ate a granola bar at the intersection of the service road and the fire tower access road, sitting on the hood of his truck with his coffee thermos and his clipboard, looking at the morning. The fire tower was visible from there, a thin steel shape on the ridge above him, maybe 400 feet of elevation gain up a gravel road. The sky had cleared after the front, and the light was sharp and yellow the way November light gets in Tennessee, and the fire tower caught it on its catwalk railing and threw it back. He noted the tower access road condition as passable on his clipboard and finished his coffee. His second radio check-in was at 10:40. It was routine. He keyed the radio, gave his position, reported the blowdown work completed, said he was heading to check the closed side trail gate and the culvert on the service road below it. Dispatch acknowledged. Standard exchange. He was already reaching to clip the radio back to his vest when the second transmission came through. It was on the same frequency. Not dispatch. The voice was different. Male, calm, measured, the specific flat tone of someone reading from a sheet. It gave a set of coordinates. That was all. No unit identifier at the start, no sign-off at the end. Just the coordinates, read clearly, and then silence. He wrote the coordinates on his clipboard. He looked at them. They fell on the closed side trail, the one that had been gated for 2 years after a significant slide had taken out a section of the tread and made the upper portion unstable. He keyed his radio and asked dispatch to identify the transmitting unit. Dispatch said they had not transmitted since his check-in. He read them the coordinates. They confirmed the location. They had no record of an active unit in that area. He checked the unit identifier that had preceded the coordinates in the transmission. Every ranger radio in the district had a unit number embedded in its transmissions, a short code that appeared at the start of any broadcast. He had caught it before the voice began. Habit, the way you catch a caller ID before you answer. He looked the number up in his field directory, the laminated card he kept in his breast pocket with the emergency contacts and the district boundaries. The number belonged to a radio that had been decommissioned 18 months earlier. Turned in, logged out, removed from service. He checked it twice. He sat with that for a moment, and then he drove the service road to the closed trail gate. The gate was a standard Forest Service installation, a steel bar across the road, padlocked to a post on one side, with a chain wrapped through the hasp on the other. A weathered sign on the bar read, "Trail closed. Unstable conditions." He had checked this gate 12 times in the past 2 seasons, and it had always been the same. He pulled up alongside it, got out, and took the padlock in his hand. Locked. Correct hasp, correct position. He looked at the chain. The mud around the base of the post on the chain side was disturbed. Fresh disturbance. The storm had left soft ground everywhere, and the mark around that post was not a rain pattern. It was the mark of hands, or something like hands, gripping the chain near the post and moving it. The chain itself sat at a slightly different angle than he remembered from his last check. It had been handled. From the inside, from the trail side of the gate, not the road side. He looked through the gate at the trail beyond. The closed trail should have been overgrown. 2 years without maintenance, without foot traffic, with the kind of aggressive secondary growth that comes back fast in Tennessee hill country after a disturbance. He had seen other closed trails in the district and knew what 2 years of closure looked like. Knee-high brush on the tread, briars reclaiming the edges, the trail becoming suggestion rather than path. This trail was clear. The tread was open, packed, the brush cut back on both sides the way a maintained trail looks in midsummer. Something had been walking it. Something had been walking it regularly enough to keep the vegetation pressed back and the surface open. He stood at the gate and looked at the clear trail running uphill through the yellow November trees, and the radio on his vest was quiet, and the only sound was the wind coming off the ridge and the distant sound of the creek below the culvert he still needed to check. He wrote the gate condition and the trail observation in his damage log. Then he drove to the base of the fire tower road and looked up at the ridge. The fire tower road was rough after the storm. Ruts from the rain runoff. A small washout near the first switchback that he could navigate around in the truck, but would need to flag for a grading crew. He drove it slowly, parked at the base of the tower structure, and got out. The tower was maybe 80 feet of open steel staircase, 4 flights of graded steps winding up to the cab and the catwalk that circled it. Access was kept unlocked for ranger inspection, a standard arrangement on this district. The cab itself locked, but the stairs open. He started climbing. The wind came at him harder as he got above the tree line. The catwalk railing vibrated under his hand, a low, metallic hum that he could feel in his palm. He had been up here before, twice in his 2 seasons, and he knew the view, the whole of his section laid out below him, the ridges running south and east, the gaps where the trail crossed from one drainage to another, the dark brown scar of the service road threading through the trees below. He got his binoculars out of his vest pocket and turned toward the closed side trail. From the catwalk, he had clear line of sight to the entire visible length of the trail, from the gate at the bottom to where it curved behind a ridge shoulder about half a mile up. The trail stood out clearly against the November trees because of what he had already seen at the gate. It was open, maintained looking, a clean brown line running uphill through the yellow and orange of the hardwoods. There was a person on it. He put the binoculars to his eyes and adjusted the focus. The figure was maybe a quarter mile up the trail, moving steadily uphill, too far for any useful detail. He could see the shape of a person, upright, walking at a measured pace, but nothing of clothing or face or build beyond the general impression of someone moving with purpose. Not hurrying, not looking around, just walking, the way a person walks on a trail they know, with that slight forward lean and the rhythm of someone who has been hiking for hours and has found their pace. He watched. The figure moved steadily toward the upper end of the trail, the end that, as far as he knew, terminated in the slide debris. He had seen photographs of the slide from the initial damage assessment, a significant mass movement that had taken out maybe 60 feet of tread and replaced it with a steep, loose field of clay and broken rock. There was no exit at the top. The trail ended in an impassable wall of debris. The figure did not slow down. He kept the binoculars on it. 11 minutes, he timed it on his watch, because timing things was what he did. The figure moved at a consistent pace toward the upper end of the trail, covering ground, getting closer to the point where the tread ended. He expected to see it stop, expected to see it turn back, or pick its way up the debris field, or do something that a person encountering an impassable obstacle would do. It did not reach the obstacle. At some point in those 11 minutes, the figure was no longer on the trail. He could not identify the moment it happened. One pass of the binoculars found it. The next pass did not. He scanned the full visible length of the trail. He scanned the slope on both sides of it. He scanned the debris field at the upper end. There was no figure. There was no movement. The trail was empty and clear and still. He stood on the catwalk for another few minutes, scanning. Nothing. The yellow trees moved in the wind. The trail stayed empty. There was no tree cover on that section thick enough to conceal a standing person in November. The hardwoods had dropped most of their leaves and the slope was visible through the trunks. No place to step off the trail and disappear. No side route he could see from his vantage. The trail was visible end to end, and the figure was simply not on it anymore. He recorded the time in his damage log, 11:34. He remembered the supervisor then, the one who had run this district before him, the old seasonal who had handed off the section and spent 2 days walking him through it before leaving. He had liked that man, a quiet, thorough person who knew the land well and explained things clearly. On the last afternoon of the handoff, standing at the truck at the end of a long day, the old supervisor had said it almost as an aside, looking out at the ridge rather than at him. He'd said, "Don't go on that trail after a wet week. We've had incidents we don't log officially." He had not asked what incidents meant. He had not followed up. He was new, and he did not want to seem credulous, and he logged everything officially. And it had seemed like the kind of thing a person said when they were tired and handing off a job and not being precise. He had stored it somewhere and mostly forgotten it. He descended the fire tower stairs thinking about it now. He could not radio from the tower. The ridge blocked his signal, which he knew from the first season. He drove back down the rough access road to where his truck could reach the repeater. Keyed his radio, tried to raise dispatch. Got static for a moment, then the dispatcher's voice, normal and clear. He told her he had a visual on a person on the closed trail, the gated trail below the tower road, and he needed to know if any permits had been issued for that section, any maintenance crew scheduled, any SAR activity he had not been briefed on. She checked. No permits, no crew, no SAR. He was the only authorized personnel on that section today. He drove back to the gate. The padlock was open. Not broken, open. The shackle was released, the lock hanging from the chain by its base, as if someone had opened it with a key and left it that way. The chain was on the ground. He stood looking at it for a long time. He had checked this lock 2 hours ago. It had been secured. He was the only person with a key to it. He put on gloves, picked up the lock, looked at it. No damage, no marks. Opened cleanly. He took photographs. He rehung the chain and replaced the lock and secured it again, and took another photograph of it locked. He noted all of this in his damage log with the time, 11:51. He drove back to the section where he could raise the repeater and radio dispatch again. He asked them to look up the unit identifier from the earlier transmission, the code that had preceded the coordinates. He read it to her. She went quiet for a moment. He heard her typing. Then she said she would look into it and get back to him. Nobody called back. He returned to the station that afternoon and transferred his field notes to the station log as he always did. The log showed his check-ins at 9:15 and 10:40. Between those two entries, where the rogue transmission would have been recorded if the station equipment had picked it up, there was a gap. 4 minutes with no recorded transmission in either direction. Not his voice, not dispatch, not the unknown unit. 4 minutes of log time with nothing in it. At the exact time he had heard the coordinates read calmly over his radio by a voice using a decommissioned unit number. He flagged the log gap to his supervisor. His supervisor said the system sometimes dropped short transmissions during weather events, and the storm the previous weekend might have caused a residual logging error. He wrote that explanation in the margin next to the gap in his own handwriting. He said later that writing it down made it feel less convincing, not more. He worked that section for one more season after this. He transferred to a different district in the spring. He did not put his reasons in writing. The retired land manager who passed this account along said that when he asked the former ranger directly why he had transferred, the man had been quiet for a moment and then said, "There was something using that trail that I could not account for, and I could not log it, and I could not leave it unlogged. Those two things together were not something I could keep doing." The closed trail is still gated. A newer sign is on the bar now, the old weathered one replaced. The tread on that section has not been inspected since the second season. Whether it is still clear or whether the brush has finally come back, nobody has said. Rangers are trained not to report what they cannot explain. Sometimes that training protects the job. The next account is about a town that does the same thing, for reasons nobody explains. He had been on the trail for 41 days when he reached the town. His feet were wrecked. A blister on his left heel that had opened and closed and opened again enough times that he had stopped trying to fix it and started just managing it. draining it each morning and taping it and putting his boot back on and walking anyway. His food was low. He had been rationing for 2 days, stretching a 3-day carry into 5, because the last resupply point had been picked over by the time he arrived, and the next mail drop was here. He needed a 0 day. He needed real food, and a bed, and a shower, and a day where he did not put his pack on. He was the kind of person who talked to everyone. That was how he had always been, curious, easy with strangers, the type who asked questions and remembered the answers and could make a waitress laugh within 4 minutes of sitting down. It had made the trail easier in some ways, harder in others. Easier because he never felt lonely in towns. Harder because he picked things up. He absorbed information the way some people absorbed worry, naturally and without trying. And by the time he left a place, he usually knew more about it than was comfortable. The town was small enough to walk end to end in 10 minutes. A main road, a diner, a combined outfitter and the hardware store, a gas station, a post office with hours that were optimistic, a motel with 6 rooms and a vacancy sign that had been on so long the plastic had faded from red to pink. A Baptist church on the north end, large for a town this size, its parking lot paved and freshly striped. The AT crossed the main road at the north end of town, just past the church, and a blue-blazed connector trail ran up behind the church toward the ridge before joining the main trail further north. He had seen it on the map. He checked into the motel first. The key was on a large plastic tag with the room number stamped into it. The kind of tag designed to be difficult to pocket accidentally. His room was clean and spare. A double bed, a bathroom with a shower head that worked, a window unit that made a sound like a truck idling. He dropped his pack and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and let himself feel how tired he was. Then he got up and went to the diner. The diner had 4 booths and a counter with 6 stools. One waitress, a woman in her 50s who moved with the efficiency of someone who had worked the same room for a long time. 2 older men at the counter who had the look of people with no particular place to be. A woman at the far booth reading a folded newspaper, not looking up. He took the booth nearest the outlet and plugged in his phone before he even opened the menu. He ordered eggs and hash browns and toast and a large coffee, and when the waitress refilled his cup the second time, he asked about trail conditions north of town. It was the standard question, the one he asked everywhere. Locals often knew things about conditions that the trail apps did not. Recent blowdowns or flooded crossings or shelter damage. She told him the main trail was fine. Good shape since they had gotten the work crew through in September. Then she paused, just for a half second, and said he should stick to the white blazes past the 3rd ridge and not follow any of the blue-blazed side trails up there. She said it the way a person says something they have said before, without drama. Some of them don't come back out the way they should, was how she put it. Then she went to check on the men at the counter. He wrote it in his trail journal with his coffee. A navigation warning, basically. Side trails in this part of the AT corridor were sometimes unmaintained, after storms rerouted water across the tread or blowdowns made sections impassable. Getting confused on a blue blaze when you thought you were following the main trail was a real and practical risk. He had done it once, 2 weeks ago, followed a blue connector for a mile before realizing it was taking him downhill in the wrong direction. Nothing strange about a local telling him to watch the blazes. He went to the outfitter after breakfast. The man behind the counter was quiet, mid-40s, with the hands of someone who did physical work and the eyes of someone who measured people carefully before saying much to them. He sold the hiker moleskin and blister tape and 2 days of food, the good stuff, the dense calorie-to-weight ratio items that the outfitters in trail towns stocked because they knew what hikers actually needed, While the man was ringing up the food, the hiker asked, without mentioning the diner, about conditions north. The man's hands paused on the register keys for just a moment. Then he continued. He said the main trail was in good shape. He said the blue-blazed connector behind the church had been rerouted, but the new marking wasn't in yet. He said to stay on the white blazes. He said it evenly, looking at the register display rather than at the hiker. And when the transaction was done, he put the items in a paper bag and handed it across the counter. And that was the end of the conversation. The hiker walked back to the motel with the bag. He was doing laundry in the machine at the end of the building, a coin-op washer he had found behind an unmarked door, when he started to notice the coincidence. Same warning, 2 different people, neither of whom had heard him ask the other. Both of them calm about it. Both of them brief. He stood listening to the washer thump and thought about it, and decided it was probably a local consensus about a navigation hazard that people in small trail towns sometimes coordinated around. A reasonable explanation. He went to the gas station in the afternoon for a sports drink and some additional snacks. The man behind the counter there was older, a different type than the outfitter, more talkative, or at least more willing to make eye contact. He asked where the hiker was headed. North, the hiker said. The man nodded once. Then he put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the hiker for a moment before he said, quietly, "Stay on the white blazes past the ridge. And don't go up there after 6. He did not explain what up there meant. He did not need to. The hiker understood that he meant the ridge behind the church, the blue-blazed connector. He bought his drink and left. He walked back up the main road toward the motel, past the church, and he stopped for a moment and looked at it. A well-maintained building, white clapboard, a modest steeple. The parking lot was full, which he had noticed before, full on a Tuesday afternoon, which meant either a funeral or a particularly active congregation. The blue-blazed connector trailhead was visible at the far edge of the parking lot, a brown post with a faded blue rectangle painted on it, and behind it the trail rose quickly into dense cover. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at his watch. It was 4:15. He went back to the motel, picked up his laundry, folded it on the bed, ate the food he had bought at the outfitter, and charged his phone to full. He knew something was wrong. He just did not know what. And he knew he was not going up that trail after 6. The problem was that dinner ran long. He sat in the diner until nearly 8, talking to the waitress between her other tasks, eating slowly the way a person eats when real food has been unavailable for days. He walked back to the motel in the dark. He was passing the church when he heard it. A child's voice from behind the building, from the direction of the blue-blazed trailhead. Crying. Not loud, soft. The kind of crying a child does when they are frightened rather than hurt, that particular thin, keening sound. He stopped. He listened. It was real, it was clear, it was coming from up the trail. He stood on the road for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and his phone at 4%, and thought about what a reasonable person did when they heard a child crying from a dark trail. The 3 warnings lined up in his head in a row: the waitress, the outfitter, the man at the gas station. And then the crying came again, and it was a child. It was clearly a child. And the trail entrance was 20 feet away. He went up the trail. The trailhead was marked by that brown post with the faded blue rectangle, and beyond it, the trail rose sharply through a stand of pine that killed the ambient light from the road almost immediately. He had his headlamp, but his phone was nearly dead, and he had not thought to grab his headlamp from the motel, so he used his phone screen, held out in front of him, the flashlight app throwing a thin white beam that reached maybe 10 feet. The ground underfoot was packed dirt and pine needles, dry, the kind of surface that does not hold a print. The crying was ahead of him, uphill. He moved toward it. He went about 100 yards before it stopped. He stood still, listened. Pine branches moving in the wind, his own breathing. Nothing else. He waited. His phone screen had auto-dimmed to save battery and the light got even smaller. He held his breath. The crying started again, uphill, further away than before. He moved another 50 yards toward it. The trail steepened here, switching back once on itself, and he could feel the elevation in his calves and in his already wrecked left heel. The sound was above him, somewhere in the dark. He stopped again, stood still, listened. Silence. Then, behind him, downhill, back at the trailhead, back where he had started, the crying again. He turned around. He looked back down the trail into the dark below him. His phone light reached the first switchback and no further. The crying was down there now, at the trailhead, in the spot he had left a minute and a half ago. He stood on that dark trail and worked through it. He had heard it uphill. He had moved uphill toward it. He had heard it shift behind him. That was not an echo, not the way echoes worked on a slope like this with trees on both sides absorbing the sound. That was not one child in one place. He was standing on a dark, unmaintained trail that 3 separate people in one small town had told him to stay off of after 6, and it was after 8, and his phone was at 4%. And whatever was making that sound was now between him and the road. He turned around and walked back down the trail. He did not run. He said later that running had felt wrong, the way making noise had felt wrong, the way calling out had felt wrong. Some decisions made by the body rather than the brain are like that, not panicked, just certain. He walked at the fastest pace he could manage on the dark, uneven trail without making more sound than necessary. He kept the phone light pointing at the ground in front of his feet. He did not look into the trees on either side. He did not look up. The trailhead post appeared at the edge of his phone light, and he stepped past it and onto the parking lot gravel. He did not slow down until he was back on the main road. Behind him, the lot was empty. The church's Tuesday gathering had ended while he was in the diner, and the cars were gone. The diner was closed, its windows dark. The gas station light was on, but the lot was empty. The motel office light was off. The town had gone quiet in that specific way small towns go quiet after 9 on a weeknight, which was a different kind of quiet than a city. Not the reduction of sound, but the complete absence of it. No traffic, no voices, no dogs. He was alone on a dark main road with 4% battery, and his motel room was 200 feet away. He walked to his room and unlocked it and went inside and locked the door behind him. He threw the deadbolt and put the chain on. He sat on the edge of the bed and plugged his phone in and watched the charging indicator appear, and then he sat there in the lamplight for a while without taking his jacket off. He did not hear anything outside. That was almost stranger. He had expected to hear something. Footsteps on the gravel outside the door, the sound he had heard on the trail, something. There was nothing. The window unit hummed. The parking lot outside the window was empty and still. He slept badly and woke early. The woman who owned the motel was in the small lobby off the office when he came out of his room, making coffee in an old drip machine that smelled like it had been making coffee in that same spot for 30 years. She was in her 70s, small, unhurried, the kind of person who had seen the beginning and end of 1,000 days in this place and treated each one the same. She handed him a cup without being asked. He asked her about the blue blaze trail behind the church. She did not look at him. She set the coffee carafe back on the burner and adjusted it slightly so the handle faced a different direction. Then she said, "That trail was formally decommissioned in 2009 after a search." Her voice was the same as her movements, unhurried, informational, as if she were reading from a document she had memorized long ago. He asked what kind of search. She said, "The kind they don't put in the paper." She refilled his cup, even though it was still mostly full. Then she asked if he wanted sugar, and when he said no, she put the sugar back on the counter and the conversation moved to the weather, and whether he would make his next shelter before the rain that was coming, and it never came back. He left town after breakfast, northbound on the white blazes, not looking at the connector trailhead as he passed the church. He reached the next town with reliable signal 2 days later and sat in a gas station parking lot and searched the trail name of the connector. Nothing. No trail record, no maintenance history, no decommission notice. He searched the name of the church combined with the town and the year 2009. One result: a missing persons report filed by a family in a county 2 hours east, saying their daughter had gone up a side trail behind a church in a small mountain town and had not come back. She had been 8 years old. The case was listed as open. There was no mention of a formal search. There was no mention of the trail being decommissioned. He read the report twice on the gas station Wi-Fi, on a phone screen showing a weak 2 bars, and then he closed the browser and went inside and bought a coffee and stood at the counter and drank it, and did not think about the specific pitch of the crying he had heard on that trail, the way it had moved, the way it had known to be behind him before he turned around. He did not finish his thru hike. He made it 4 more days, and then he took a road crossing exit to a town with a bus station and went home. He told people it was his feet, which was partly true. He submitted the account to a hiking podcast that recorded it, and then never aired it. The podcast host told him by email that the episode had been pulled for editorial reasons without explaining what those reasons were. He does not discuss the account in detail unless someone asks directly. He left that town the next morning and he has not been back. He said once, to the person who eventually passed the account along, that the part he came back to most often was not the sound on the trail, it was the town. The way 3 people had given him the same warning without coordinating. The way the motel owner had known exactly what to say and exactly when to stop saying it. The way nobody had seemed surprised when he came back without the answer. They all knew, he said. Whatever it is up there, they've known about it for a long time. And they've figured out the exact amount they're willing to say. He left that town the next morning. The next account comes from a couple who thought they were returning to familiar ground. They were wrong about what familiar means. She submitted the account 2 years after the trip. Her husband declined to add to it. She noted in her submission that he stopped the conversation any time it came up in front of their children. Not dramatically, not with any explanation, just redirected the subject with the ease of someone who had made that decision once and did not need to revisit it. She said she understood why. She also said she needed to write it down. They had done this section before. That was the part she kept coming back to in her submission, the familiarity of it, the way it made what happened harder to categorize. 3 years earlier, they had done the same stretch of Pennsylvania Ridge, the same gap campsite, the same piped spring a 1/4 mile off the main trail. They had notes from that first trip, penciled observations in the margins of the trail guide. Spring reliable, campsite flat, morning climb steep but short, good views from the boulder field at the top. They were not going somewhere new. They were returning somewhere known. It was the 3rd day of a 5-day section. They had started the trip well, good weather, dry trail, the kind of hiking that reminds you why you do it. The Pennsylvania Ridge section is different from the mountain terrain further south. Less dramatic in elevation, but more exposed. The trail running along flat rocky spine with boulder fields on either side and low scrub instead of canopy in the open sections. You can see a long way from up there on a clear day. You can also be seen. They reached the Gap campsite in the late afternoon. She recognized it immediately, the flat area below the trail, the fire ring that somebody had maintained with new rocks since their last visit, the path down to the spring worn smooth by years of boots. He pointed out the dead tree on the slope above the site, a big oak that had been dying 3 years ago and was further along now, most of its bark gone and its upper branches silver against the sky. Same tree, same site. It felt like coming back to something that had been waiting for them to return, which was a comfortable feeling. That was the wrong word, she would write later. It felt assumed. They pitched the tent, a 2-person backpacking tent with a mesh inner and a rain fly that they left off in the dry weather. He filtered water at the spring while she got the stove going. She sat on a flat boulder near the tent and cooked while he scouted the upper end of the campsite, checking for widowmakers in the trees above. An old habit. They ate while the sun went down behind the western ridge, the light going orange and then red in the gap and then gone. He pointed out a scar on the distant ridge that might have been a burn from last summer. They talked about nothing in particular, the comfortable silence of people who had been together long enough to not need to fill space. She hung the food bag while he washed the pot. They reviewed the next day's mileage on the paper map by headlamp, 8 miles to the next shelter, with the steep descent into the gap around mile 4 that she remembered as harder on the knees than it looked on the profile. They agreed on a 6 o'clock start. She checked the tent seams out of habit, and he secured the tent stakes that had pulled slightly in the soft ground near the fire ring. Normal things. The right things. She was awake when the footsteps started. She had not been fully asleep. She rarely was on the first night in a new camp, even a familiar one. She was in that shallow half-rest where you are aware of sound, but not yet reacting to it, and the footsteps came up gradually enough that she was tracking them for a few seconds before she understood what she was hearing. They were on the game trail. She knew the game trail from their first visit, a faint path that ran parallel to the AT about 30 yards from the campsite, used by deer coming down from the ridge to the spring. The footsteps were on it, or near it, moving from south to north at a slow and heavy pace. Bipedal. Not the cloven quick step of a deer, not the shuffling 4-point walk of a bear. 2-footed, evenly spaced, with the weight distribution of something significant behind each step. She put her hand on his arm and he was already awake. They lay still and listened. The footsteps continued north on the game trail, slow and steady, and then stopped. She counted to 20. Then they started again, the same direction, the same pace, then stopped again. She heard him exhale slowly beside her. Then the footsteps changed direction. That was the detail. That was the thing that separated it from a deer or a bear or a late hiker coming down from the ridge. The footsteps turned. They moved off the game trail and into the scrub on the far side of the campsite, south of the tent, and the sound changed from the soft compression of packed dirt to the specific crunch of Pennsylvania shale under weight. Moving south now, moving around. Both of them were fully awake and neither was speaking. The sound completed a circuit. Game trail on the north side of the campsite, scrub and shale on the south, connecting somewhere in the trees at both ends, a slow loop around the tent. She tracked it by sound in the dark, her eyes open but useless. The night was overcast and the camp offered no light. She counted the time, 7 minutes for one full circuit. 7 minutes of slow, deliberate movement around the perimeter of their camp, never approaching, never pausing at the tent, never making any sound other than footfall. Then it started again. Another circuit, same direction, same pace, same 7 minutes. He reached for the headlamp without making a sound, and she put her hand on his wrist and shook her head once. She did not know why. It just felt wrong to turn on a light. It felt like it would change something. They lay in the dark and listened to the circuits. She lost count after 5 or 6. At some point, she could not say exactly when, because time in the dark under those circumstances becomes elastic. The sound stopped. Not gradually, just stopped between one step and the next, the way a recording stops. They did not sleep. At first light, before the sun was actually above the ridge, she got out of the tent and walked to the spring. The ground around the spring outlet was soft mud, the kind of mud that holds a print as clearly as plaster. She crouched down and looked. Large prints, bipedal, spaced further apart than any walking stride she could account for. She had done enough hiking to know animal prints, and she knew what bear prints looked like. The wide pad, the claw marks at the top of each toe. These were not that. The shape was wrong in a way she could not articulate precisely. Too narrow in some places, too elongated in others. The stride was wrong, and they were all facing the same direction. Every print at that spring was facing inward, toward the campsite. Not one of them faced the other way, not toward the spring outlet, not toward the game trail, not toward the ridge. They had all arrived at the spring from behind, circled to face the camp, and stayed there. None of them faced out. She called for him. He came down from the tent and crouched beside her and looked at the prints for a long time without saying anything. Then he stood up and said they should get moving. She went back and broke down the tent while he packed the cooking gear, both of them working faster than usual without discussing the pace. She took 3 photographs of the prints before they left. The mud was soft enough to hold the detail clearly, but her hands were not steady, and the morning light was still thin and flat. And all 3 photographs came back blurry in the way photographs taken in a hurry in poor light always do. Not useless, but not clear. Enough to show that something had been there. Not enough to show what. They put on their packs and walked north without eating breakfast, and neither of them looked back at the spring. She watched the dog for 20 minutes by the dim light of her phone screen, held low and angled away from the shelter opening so it would not carry outside. The dog did not move. Not a twitch of the ears, not a shift of the weight, not the small restless adjustments a dog makes when it is merely alert rather than locked. He was locked. Every part of him pointed at the dark outside the shelter with the absolute stillness of an animal that has made a decision to be invisible. The woods were quiet in a way that felt structural. Not the quiet of a calm night, but the quiet of a room where everyone has stopped talking at once. No insects, no small rustling in the leaf litter, no wind in the scrub. The creak she had been able to hear faintly when she fell asleep had gone quiet too, or she could no longer hear it over the sound of her own attention. 20 minutes. She counted them. Then she turned on her headlamp. She kept the beam low and angled it at the open front of the shelter, the packed dirt apron that ran between the platform edge and the drip line of the roof, the standard cleared area in front of every AT shelter where hikers cooked and hung food bags and left their boots. She swept it slowly across the dirt. 2 sets of prints, side by side, facing the shelter. Starting at the drip line of the roof, the precise point where the rain fell off the edge, and pointing directly at the platform where she lay. The same prints from the gap spring, the same prints from the first spring, the same wrong stride, the same wrong shape, the same size. Here at the shelter, 6 miles north of the piped spring where she had last seen them that morning. None facing away, not one print pointing outward. Whatever had made them had walked to the edge of the roof line and stopped and stood there facing inward and had not turned around to leave. She sat up. She put her hand on her husband's shoulder and pressed once, firmly, and he came awake fast the way experienced campers do. Eyes open, no sound, hand immediately going to the headlamp on his wrist. She pointed at the ground in front of the shelter. He looked. She watched his face in the reflected light of her headlamp. She watched him take it in. He did not speak. He sat up fully and reached for his pack and began rolling his sleeping bag. No discussion, no confirmation needed. She was already moving. She leaned over and shook the young woman's shoulder gently, the one nearest her. The young woman came awake, confused, blinking. She told her quietly that they needed to make an early start and were heading out now, sorry to wake her. The young woman looked at the darkness outside the shelter and the time on her phone, and the confused expression stayed on her face, but she nodded. Her partner stirred. The dog, still standing at the platform edge, did not look back at any of them. He kept his eyes on the dark outside. They packed in the specific controlled silence of people who have agreed without speaking to make no unnecessary sound. She rolled her pad and stuffed it and compressed her sleeping bag and buckled her pack in the dark, using feel and familiarity because she did not want to move her headlamp away from the shelter opening for long. He was faster. He always packed faster. And he was shouldered up before she finished her hip belt. He stood at the back of the platform with his headlamp off and waited. She buckled the last buckle and stood. The beagle finally moved. He stepped back from the platform edge and came to the young woman and pressed against her leg and stood there. The young woman looked down at him and then at the experienced couple and started to ask something. The man shook his head once, gently. Not now. The young woman closed her mouth. They stepped off the platform into the dirt in front of the shelter, both of them, and she looked down at the prints around her feet as she moved through them. They were clear and deep and real in the dirt. She did not take a photograph. She had 3 photographs already and they were all blurry, and she did not want to spend any more time standing in those prints than necessary. They moved out of the shelter and onto the trail and started north. No discussion of pace. He set it and she matched it, and they walked in the pre-dawn dark with their headlamps on, moving fast on the rocky Pennsylvania tread, and the woods around them were ordinary. Birds started up after the first mile, the early pre-dawn calls, and then insects came back, and a squirrel hit the ground somewhere to the right of the trail, and everything was normal and noisy and full of ordinary life the way the woods are on any autumn morning. Every time they passed through a gap, she moved faster without thinking about it. They were through each one before she had consciously registered entering it. He did the same. They did not look at the mud at the edges of gaps. They did not discuss why. The agreement was simply there between them, arrived at without negotiation, honored without acknowledgement. 4 hours of hard hiking. They hit the road crossing at the bottom of the ridge descent at 9:15 in the morning, came out of the trees onto the gravel shoulder, and his truck was there in the small turnout where he had left it at the start of the trip. He unlocked it and they put their packs in the bed and got in, and he started the engine and the heat came on, and she sat in the passenger seat with her hands in front of the vent and let herself breathe. He drove. She watched the tree line out the passenger window as the turnout disappeared behind them. The woods looked like woods. Ordinary, still unremarkable. In the next town, they found a diner and ate real food and sat across from each other in a booth, and he called his brother. She watched him while he talked. Football scores, the weather, whether his brother had gotten the gutter fixed before winter. His voice was even and relaxed, the voice he used with family, and he did not look at her while he was talking. He looked at the table, at the window, at the other people in the diner, anywhere but at her. She understood it. The call was not about the gutter. The call was about hearing a voice that was ordinary, about being connected for 15 minutes to a world where nothing strange had happened, where the morning was a normal Tuesday morning, and the biggest problem was whether the gutter had been fixed. She did not begrudge him that. She sat with her coffee and let him have it. She showed the photographs to 2 people afterward. A close friend first, who looked at them on her phone screen, tilting it to catch the light, and said it looked like a bear. Then a wildlife biologist who lived 2 streets over, a woman who spent her professional life identifying animal sign and field conditions. She looked at the photographs carefully, all 3 of them, for longer than the friend had. She asked about the stride length, the terrain, the substrate. Then she said she was not sure what she was looking at. She asked if she could have copies of the photographs to examine more closely. She said no. She did not say why. She just said no and put her phone back in her pocket, and the biologist did not ask again. 3 years later, they still hike. They do long trips, big sections, technical terrain. They are still those people. But they have not returned to that section of the Pennsylvania Ridge, and when the subject of it comes up near their children, she watches him change the subject with the smoothness of long practice. A gentle redirect so seamless the kids have never once noticed the pattern. She said in her submission that she did not blame him for that. She said the reason she submitted the account at all was that she needed somewhere to put the detail that kept coming back to her. The one that sat in her chest with a weight she could not shift. Not the sound of the circuits in the dark, not the dog standing rigid at the platform edge, not even finding the prints for the second time, 8 miles north, facing inward. The thing that stayed with her was simpler than any of that. It was the fact that there were no outward prints. Not at the gap spring, not at the piped spring, not at the shelter. Wherever those prints had come from, whatever had made them, it had arrived at each location from behind and faced inward and had not turned around to leave. It had come from somewhere and gone nowhere, as if it had always been there, waiting in the one direction she was not looking. The footprints all faced in, she wrote at the end of her submission. Not one of them faced out. Whatever made them never left. She still has the 3 blurry photographs. The next account has clearer evidence. That does not make it better. He had been using trail cameras on backpacking trips for 11 years. That was worth understanding before anything else about this account. He was not a person who brought one for novelty or because he hoped to catch something strange. He brought it the way some people brought a fishing rod or a sketch pad. It was his version of paying attention, a way of documenting the natural world that passed through a campsite while he slept. He had hundreds of hours of footage across dozens of trips. Deer, mostly. A black bear once in the Shenandoah going through a campsite 3 sites down from his with methodical disinterest. A fox, several porcupines, a barred owl landing on a tent stake at 2 in the morning, for reasons the owl apparently found sufficient. Never anything he could not identify. Never anything that made him watch the footage twice. He was methodical in the way that some people are methodical as a personality trait rather than a professional requirement. The kind of person whose gear was always in the same pocket of the same bag, who kept a trip log with daily mileage and weather observations and notes on trail conditions, who checked the camera battery and angle before getting into his sleeping bag every night the way other people check the door lock before bed. His wife would describe him, when the account was later shared, as the least superstitious person she had ever known. 14 years of marriage, and she had never seen him avoid a ladder or knock on wood or do anything that suggested a belief in forces outside the measurable. He was an engineer. He trusted systems. He set out on a solo 3-day trip on an AT section in the Maryland and southern Pennsylvania corridor in early October. This section of the trail was different from the mountain country further south. Rolling terrain, farmland visible through the trees in the valleys. Stone walls running through the woodlots where old property boundaries had been. Wooden stiles crossing fences where the trail moved from public land into privately held fields and back again. a pastoral quality to it that made the woods feel less remote than the ridges further south, though once you were in the woodlots, the isolation was real enough. No cell signal in the tree sections. The nearest trailhead was a 30-minute hike in any direction. He found his campsite in a tree break at the edge of a woodlot, a small flat area that had been used before, a fire ring of stacked stones, the ground scuffed clear of leaves by previous tents, screened from the trail by a stand of young maples, open to a pasture field on the east side through a gap in the stone wall. Good site, the kind of place that felt settled and manageable. He set up his tent first, then the camera. He mounted it on a small maple at chest height, angled to cover the tent and the clearing in front of it. Checked the frame on the preview screen. Tent in the lower right, fire ring in the center, the stone wall visible in the background on the left. Good coverage. He checked the battery level, confirmed the motion sensitivity setting, and went back to make dinner. He cooked on his small stove while the light went. Dehydrated meal, hot water, ate from the bag because it saved weight in dishes. He wrote his daily notes in the trip log while he ate. Mileage, weather. A note about a section of tread near a creek crossing that had significant erosion and probably needed reporting to the trail club. After dinner, he read for an hour by headlamp, lying in his sleeping bag with his book propped on his chest. He checked the camera one more time before turning his light off. Still running, battery at 91%. No triggers yet. He zipped his sleeping bag and was asleep by 9:30. The night sounds were the sounds of farmland edge habitat. A dog barking somewhere far down in the valley, carrying up through the still air. Wind moving through the woodlot in the slow, steady way that meant no weather coming. A car on a road somewhere below the ridge, its engine a brief presence and then gone. The specific night sound of a pasture field. Insects still going in the October grass. Quieter than August, but not yet finished. He was used to these sounds. He slept well in places like this. He woke once. His watch said just past 2 in the morning. He lay still for a moment, not sure what had woken him. Then he heard it, something moving in the dry leaves at the edge of the tree line to the east, near the stone wall. The crackle and shift of something walking through October leaves. He lay still and listened. It moved for a few seconds, stopped, and then did not resume. He waited a full minute in the silence that followed. Then he decided it was a deer working the edge of the pasture. A completely reasonable conclusion, because deer absolutely did exactly that every night, in exactly this kind of habitat, at exactly this hour. He checked his watch again, turned over, and went back to sleep. In the morning, he broke camp in the order he always broke camp, which was tent last. He took down his food bag, packed his cook kit, rolled his sleeping bag, deflated his sleeping pad. Then he took the camera down from the maple and reviewed the footage as he always did, scrolling through the motion-triggered clips on the small preview screen while he stood in the pale October morning light. The first clip was a deer. 8:47 p.m., a doe moving through the left side of the frame, pausing at the fire ring, moving on. Normal. The second clip was him. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. He watched himself sit up in the tent. He watched himself unzip the tent door from the inside, the specific sound of the zipper audible on the camera's audio track. A long, slow pull. He watched himself stand up from the tent and walk across the campsite to the tree line at the east side, near the stone wall. He walked steadily, without hesitation, without a flashlight. He reached the edge of the camera's frame and stopped. His back was to the camera. He stood there. The next clip began without a gap. The camera's motion sensor had kept a recording because he was still in partial frame. He was still standing at the tree line. The timestamp advanced. 2:16, 2:18, 2:20. He stood without moving, his back to the camera, at the edge where the woodlot met the stone wall, and the pasture opened up beyond it. 2:25 a.m. He walked back to the tent. He crouched at the opening, zipped it closed from the outside, and presumably got back into his sleeping bag. The camera recorded the tent, still and dark, for another 30 seconds before the motion stopped and the clip ended. He stood in the morning light holding the small camera and watched the timestamp. 2:14 to 2:25. 11 minutes. He checked his watch from the night, the one he had looked at when he woke, which he had not changed and which matched the camera's clock. Just past 2 in the morning, he had noted. He had heard something in the leaves. He had lain still and decided it was a deer. He had turned over and gone back to sleep. He had no memory of leaving the tent. He did not sleepwalk. He had shared a bed with his wife for 14 years, and she had never once described him doing anything unusual in the night. No restlessness, no episodes, nothing. He had no history of parasomnia, no medical condition that would account for it, no medication that listed sleep disruption as a side effect. He was a person who lay down, slept, and woke up where he had lain down. That was simply what he did. In the footage, he stood at the tree line for 11 minutes with his back to the camera. He did not move. He did not look around. He did not appear distressed or confused. He stood with the stillness of someone waiting or listening, facing whatever was on the other side of the stone wall in the dark pasture field. He watched the clip 4 times on the small screen. Then he packed the camera into his bag and shouldered his pack and hiked out, and the strangeness of it sat in him for the rest of the trip like a stone in a boot, present and unignorable and not yet explicable. It was not until he was home on his laptop that he watched the footage for the 4th time. He pulled the footage up on his laptop that evening, transferred from the camera's memory card to a folder on his desktop. Larger screen, better resolution than the preview display in the field. He watched the deer clip first, then the clip of himself standing up from the tent and walking to the tree line. It was the same footage he had watched 4 times that morning. It was not easier to watch on a larger screen. If anything, it was harder. The details were clearer, the timestamp digits sharper, the way he moved across the campsite more visible. The unhesitating walk, the absence of a flashlight, the way he stopped at exactly the same spot at the tree line and stood without moving. He watched it a 2nd time, then a 3rd. On the 4th viewing, he saw the shape. He could not have said exactly why he caught it on the 4th pass and not the first 3. The eye finds things it is not looking for sometimes. After enough repetitions, when it has stopped tracking the main subject and starts filling in the frame. He had been watching himself, his own silhouette at the tree line, and on the 4th pass his attention slipped slightly to the left and he saw it. Between 2 trees, in the space where the woodlot met the stone wall, slightly behind and to the left of where he was standing, low to the ground, present in the frame, not moving. He stopped the clip and went back 10 seconds and played it again, slowly. It was there from the beginning of the clip. Not arriving during the footage, already there when the clip began, already in position between those 2 trees before he walked into frame. He scrubbed through to the end. It was there through all 11 minutes. The same position, the same shape, not moving while he stood motionless at the tree line. Then, on the frame immediately after he turned and walked back to the tent, it was gone. Not gradually. Gone on the cut between one frame and the next. He sat back in his chair and looked at the paused image on his screen. The shape was low and dark and not clearly defined at the resolution available, even on the laptop screen. Too large to be a fox or a raccoon, the wrong profile for a deer at rest, too compact, too round in some way he could not articulate, without the elongated neck and body shape a bedded deer produced. He could not make out limbs or a head distinctly. It was a mass, a density between the trees that was darker than the surrounding dark and that held a shape consistent enough across 11 minutes to rule out a trick of the light or a compression artifact in the footage. It was something. It was there. It had been there the entire time he stood at the tree line with his back to it. He called a friend who did video work, editing, some production. The kind of person who had spent years looking at footage professionally and knew what cameras did and did not capture reliably. He sent the clip. His friend called him back an hour later. His friend said the shape was real, meaning it was not a compression artifact or a camera error. He said the positioning was consistent across the clip, ruling out a moving light source casting a shadow. He said the size was hard to determine precisely without knowing the exact distance from the camera to the tree line, but based on the relative scale of the trees, it was large. Then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Whatever that is, it's looking at you." He said it matter-of-factly, the way a person states an observation they would rather not be making. The shape's orientation, the aspect of it that faced outward from between the trees, was directed toward where he stood at the tree line, toward his back. Whatever it was, it had been positioned facing him for the full 11 minutes. He sat with that for a long time after the call. The trail sign came back to him the next day, not immediately, but in the way that things surface when the mind has been turning them over without permission. On the first day of the trip, crossing a stone wall stile, he had seen a sign on the post at the base of the stile. Not an official trail marker, a hand-lettered board, weathered but legible, nailed flat to the post at about knee height, where a person crossing the stile would look down and see it. 4 words: "Do not camp below the wall." He had read it and processed it as a landowner notice, the kind of thing private property holders sometimes posted where the trail crossed their land, discouraging camping in certain areas for practical reasons: crop damage, liability, livestock disturbance. He had camped in the woodlot above the wall, and so he had filed the sign as not applicable. The campsite was above the wall, on the correct side. He measured it in his memory now, the position of that campsite relative to the stone wall on the east side. He had pitched his tent in the flat area in the tree break. The stone wall ran along the east edge of the woodlot, where the trees ended and the pasture began. He had camped in the woodlot, above the wall, which meant on the uphill side, which meant technically above it in elevation. But the wall on the east side of his campsite, the one visible in the left background of his trail camera footage, was not that wall. That wall ran not east-west along the field edge, but north-south, cutting through the woodlot itself, dividing it. His campsite was west of that wall, below it, by approximately 15 feet of horizontal distance. He had read the sign and camped on what he believed was the correct side and been wrong by 15 feet. 3 weeks after the trip, on a dry Saturday morning in November, he drove back to the trailhead and hiked into the campsite. 30 minutes in, clear daylight, his purpose specific and practical. He went directly to the tree line on the east side of the campsite, to the position between the 2 trees where the shape had been in the footage. He knew the trees by their relative position to the camera mount point. He had his own footage as a reference, and he found the spot without difficulty. At the base of the left tree, on the side of the trunk facing the campsite, the bark was worn smooth. Not damaged, not clawed or scraped or broken the way bark looks when a deer rubs velvet or a bear marks territory. Smooth. Polished, almost, at a height of roughly hip level, on the specific side of the trunk that faced west toward where the tent had been. The smoothness had a shape to it, a slightly concave oval, as if something had pressed against that bark repeatedly over time, leaning against the tree and facing the campsite. He put his palm against it. The bark was smooth under his hand in the way that wood becomes smooth through long, repeated contact. Not recent. Not from 3 weeks ago. This had been happening for a long time. He stood in the November woodlot with his hand on the smooth bark and looked at the spot where his tent had been. And he thought about the 11 minutes of footage and the shape that had been there before he walked into frame and gone on the frame after he walked away, and whatever it was that he had been standing 2 feet in front of with his back turned and no memory of doing it. He submitted the account to a trail safety forum. The moderators flagged it and passed it to a trail safety organization, who reached out to him for more information. He responded once, providing the footage and the photographs of the bark, and then did not respond to further contact. His account was submitted anonymously and has remained that way. He still uses trail cameras. He said this in his one response to the trail safety organization, and it struck the person who read it as the most unsettling detail in the entire account. Not the footage, not the shape, not the 11 minutes he cannot account for. The fact that he still goes out, still mounts the camera, still reviews the footage every morning, because he needs to know what happens while he sleeps. He also said he was not entirely sure that was the true reason anymore. The enhanced still from the footage lives in a folder on his laptop desktop. The folder has a name that tells you nothing about what is inside it. He has not opened it since he put the image there. He has not deleted it either. His friend, the video editor, has not mentioned the clip again since the phone call. He said once, months later, in an unrelated conversation, that he sometimes wished he had not looked so carefully on the 4th viewing. He did not say why. He did not need to. He still uses trail cameras. He says he needs to know what happens while he sleeps. The last account, the one this video ends on, was written by someone who watched that section for 11 years and has asked not to be contacted again. The document arrived by email. No return address in the sender field, or rather, an address that resolved to nothing when replied to. A string of characters that looked like an address and functioned as one for the purpose of delivery, but led nowhere when you tried to go back through it. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained no text. There was one attachment, a 4-page document, typed, single-spaced, in a plain font with no header or footer or identifying information of any kind. The first sentence read, "I am writing this because I am no longer required to not write it." What followed was the account of a woman who had worked the same 20-mile section of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina for 11 years as a corridor ranger. Her name is not included here. The district is not identified precisely. These are her conditions, stated at the end of the document in a single paragraph, and they have been honored. She began with her credentials, and the decision to begin there was itself a choice that told you something about her. 11 years on the same section. She knew every reliable spring, every blow-down-prone tree, every hiker pattern through every season. She knew the difference between a shelter that had been raided by a bear and a shelter that had been ransacked by a person who wanted it to look like a bear. She knew how erosion moved on her section after a heavy rain, which switchbacks collected water, which creek crossings became impassable in a wet spring. She made no errors of observation. That was the phrase she used. She was precise enough to know when something was outside the range of what she could observe and explain, and disciplined enough to know that this was not a comfortable position for a person who documented everything. She documented everything. Duplicate logs, one official, submitted to the district office, one personal, kept at home in a fireproof box, weekly trail walks, shelter register checks, water quality measurements at 3 springs on her section. Wildlife observation notes that she had maintained consistently enough to constitute a genuine longitudinal record. Search and rescue coordination for the 2 or 3 incidents per year that required it. Ankle injuries, a case of severe disorientation, one lightning strike that had required a helicopter evacuation. She was systematic in the way that some people are systematic as a form of respect for the work, as a way of taking it seriously, and she had maintained that system for 11 years without significant exception. The shelter near the junction was a standard lean-to design, open front, sleeping platform raised about 18 inches off the ground on pressure-treated posts, a corrugated metal roof. It sat at the junction of the main AT and a closed fire road that had been gated in 2009. The gate locked with a district padlock that she checked on every weekly walk. Below the junction, maybe 200 feet downslope, was a spring-fed pond, a small dark body of water, maybe a quarter acre, still and cold year-round, fed by a seep from the ridge above. The trail was rerouted in 2011 to move the junction marker 50 feet north, which meant the old junction post was pulled and a new metal post was set. The new post had no sign on it. There had been discussion about what sign to put there, and the discussion had not resolved, and eventually the sign had simply not been put up, and the bare metal post became what marked that junction. In her 3rd year on the section, she began to receive reports from hikers who had stayed at the shelter near the junction. The reports were not dramatic. Hikers on the AT were experienced enough, generally, to distinguish between the ordinary sounds of a backcountry shelter: animals under the platform, boards settling in temperature changes, mice in the walls, and something that warranted a report. The people who filed these reports were the careful kind. Experienced backpackers, section hikers with multiple seasons, one retired wildlife biologist who specifically noted in his report that the sound he heard was inconsistent with any animal behavior he was familiar with. The sound was knocking. From beneath the shelter floor, from the space between the platform and the ground. Not scratching, not scurrying, not the random percussion of an animal moving through a confined space. Knocking. Deliberate, spaced, rhythmic. She investigated. She crawled under the platform with a flashlight on 3 separate occasions across 2 different trips. She found the usual shelter underside habitat: old leaf litter, some scat that she identified as raccoon, evidence of a groundhog den that had been abandoned. She found no animal in residence. She found no structural feature that would produce a rhythmic knocking sound. She logged it as animal activity, because that was the only category available to her that fit a sound from under the floor, and she moved on. In her 5th year, the reports changed. 3 separate groups in the same month, October, all reporting the same thing: knocking from beneath the floor. But now, with the specific detail that had not appeared in the earlier reports, the knocking came in groups of 3. Not 2, not 4. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause. Always after midnight. One group reported that when they began packing up to leave at 2 in the morning, the knocking became louder and faster. When the last person stepped off the platform, it stopped entirely. Not gradually, immediately, as if whatever was producing it had registered the departure. She went to the shelter herself. A weeknight in mid-October, when the weather was cold enough to discourage casual camping, and the register showed no planned visits. She arrived before dark, checked the area, confirmed she was alone. She lay on the platform with her powerful flashlight in her hand and the light off. She had brought a notebook and a pen, and she intended to document whatever she heard with times and descriptions in the same way she documented everything. At 1:47 in the morning, the knocking began. 3 knocks from beneath her. She felt them as much as heard them. A vibration through the platform boards, transmitted up through the wood and into her back where she lay. She did not move. She wrote the time in her notebook without using her light, by feel, pressing hard enough with the pen that she could read it later. 3 more knocks. She counted the pause. Approximately 4 seconds. 3 more. She turned on the flashlight and looked over the edge of the platform at the underside of the shelter. Nothing moved. Nothing ran. The flashlight beam covered the full width of the space beneath the platform, and the space was empty of any animal, and the knocking stopped exactly at the moment the light came on. Not before, not after. At the moment. As if the light itself was what ended it. She lay back and turned the light off. 3 knocks. She turned the light on. Silence. She did this 4 times. The pattern held every time. Knocking in darkness, silence in light. The transition between the 2 states instantaneous and precise. She documented all 4 cycles in her notebook with times. Then she lay in the dark with the flashlight in her hand and thought about what she was dealing with. And the conclusion she arrived at was one she could not write in an official log, and one she was not prepared to say out loud even to herself, not yet. She wrote it in her personal log that night when she got home, but she did not write it in the official record. She wrote in the official record that she had investigated reported sounds at the shelter near the junction and had found no evidence of a structural issue or an animal in residence. She recommended a follow-up inspection of the platform supports in the spring. That was the first entry in the gap between the 2 logs. The gap that would grow year by year until the personal log held 3 times what the official one did. In her 7th year, the reports changed again. A group of 3 hikers, all experienced, all with multiple AT seasons between them, stayed at the shelter on a night in late October. They filed a detailed report, the kind of report that took time to write, the kind that people filed when they needed to put something outside themselves because carrying it alone was becoming difficult. She had seen reports like that before. She knew what they indicated about the seriousness of what had been experienced. The knocking had come as before. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. After midnight from beneath the platform. But this time, after the 3rd cycle of knocking, there had been a voice. Not words. Not a complete human vocalization. A sound that one of the 3 hikers described in the written report as resembling a human voice attempting to form the shape of language without having the mechanism to complete it. Not an animal sound, they were specific about this, all 3 of them independently. Not wind through the shelter structure. Something that occupied the same frequency range as a human voice, that rose and fell with the cadence of speech, that suggested the intention of communication without achieving it. As if something had learned the pattern of human speech by listening from a distance, from outside the specific architecture of the human throat, and was attempting to reproduce it with different equipment. One of them had a recording. He had been awake when the voice started and had had the presence of mind to open his phone and start recording before he moved or spoke or in any way indicated that he was awake. The recording was 47 seconds long. She listened to it twice in her truck in the parking lot of the trailhead, with the volume turned up and the windows up and the engine off. The quality was poor. Phone microphones in a shelter at night picked up wind interference and the ambient sound of the metal roof and the breathing of the other 2 people in the shelter. But beneath all of that, in the frequency range she was listening for, there was something. She was not a sound engineer. She could not tell you what it was. She could tell you that it was not wind and not an animal and not a person sleeping. She could tell you that it had pattern. That was the word she used in her personal log, pattern. It had the pattern of an attempt. She logged it officially as unidentified audio, possible wind or animal vocalization. She noted that the shelter platform supports should be inspected for structural issues that might amplify sound from beneath the floor. In her personal log, she wrote, It sounds like it is trying to say something it does not know how to say. She began keeping the second log more carefully after that. Not because she had decided something definitive, because she had begun to suspect that the official log was not going to remain fully intact. In year 8, she arrived at the shelter on her weekly walk to find the register disturbed. Not damaged, the box was closed, the register inside it dry and intact. But 2 entries that she remembered reading on the previous week's visit were gone. The pages had been torn out cleanly, close to the binding, the kind of clean removal that required care and a steady hand. The entries had been from a group of 4 who had stayed the week before last, whose names and dates and notes on trail conditions she could recall specifically because she had read them and noted in her personal log that they had mentioned hearing something under the floor. She was the only person with regular access to that register. She had not torn out those pages. She stood at the register box and looked at the torn edges for a long time, and then she photographed them. And then she walked the rest of her section and drove home, and sat in her kitchen and thought about what it meant that something was being removed from the official record, and whether that removal was coming from above her or from somewhere else entirely, and she was not sure which possibility disturbed her more. She drove to the nearest town the following weekend, not for the trail, to visit a woman she had been told about by a local road crew supervisor who had mentioned, in passing, that if she ever wanted to understand the history of that ridge, she should talk to this woman, who had grown up there, and whose family had farmed the valley below the Junction Ridge for 3 generations. The woman was in her late 70s, a retired school teacher, sharp and direct, and clearly accustomed to people coming to ask her things they could not ask anyone else. She sat in the woman's kitchen, which was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke from a stove in the corner, and she described what she had been observing: the knocking, the voice, the register pages. She described it plainly, in the same tone she used for official reports, because that was the tone she trusted. The woman listened without interrupting. When the ranger finished, the woman was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then she said, "My grandfather told us not to sleep at that junction." She said it the way a person recites something learned by repetition, something passed down with enough consistency that it had become fact rather than story. He said the pond draws things and the hollow holds them. The ranger asked what kinds of things. The woman shook her head once, not dismissively, but with the precision of someone declining to speculate beyond what they knew. She asked whether anyone in the family had seen or heard anything specific at the junction. The woman said, "We didn't stay to find out. That's the point." She drove back to the district that afternoon and submitted her structural concerns report, the one recommending removal of the shelter due to platform integrity issues. The recommendation was approved without delay, which itself gave her a moment's pause. She had made maintenance recommendations before that had taken 2 or 3 budget cycles to action. This one moved in 6 weeks. She did not ask why. The shelter was removed in the spring of 2013. The platform and walls and roof were taken down by a maintenance crew and the materials hauled out. The concrete footings were left, a standard decision when removal was for safety rather than relocation, since pulling footings required excavation equipment that was not worth mobilizing for a structure that size. The junction was left with the bare metal post and no sign, and the concrete slab where the shelter had stood, and the fire road gate 50 feet to the south, and the pond below. She returned to the junction site 2 weeks after the removal. She sat on the edge of the concrete slab and looked at the empty space where the shelter had been, and thought about the clean removal of the register pages, and the recording in her truck, and the old woman's grandfather's instruction. The register was gone with the shelter. The box had been mounted to the shelter wall and removed with it. A new register would be installed on the post eventually, For now, the post was bare. She had expected to feel something resolved about the removal. She did not. In June of that year, 6 weeks after the shelter came down, the first report arrived from a hiker who had camped at the foundation site. The concrete slab, open to the sky now. A flat surface convenient for a tent in an area without many flat surfaces. He had heard knocking from beneath the concrete. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. After midnight. She sat at her desk and read the report, and then sat for a while without moving. The shelter was gone. The knocking was not. She wrote in her personal log that evening in the careful handwriting she had maintained across 8 years of parallel documentation. Whatever this is, it is not in the shelter. The shelter was just where people stopped long enough to hear it. She began tracking the seasonal pattern of the reports after that. It took 2 more years to confirm what she suspected. The reports clustered in late October and early April. Not July, not August, not the peak of hiking season when the shelter had seen its heaviest use. Not the shoulder months of May, June, September. October and April. The transitional months. The months when the light changed direction. When the year moved from one state to another. She did not know what to make of that. She wrote it in her log because she did not know what to make of it. And things she did not know what to make of went into the log because somewhere in 11 years of accumulated observation, she had developed the discipline of recording what she saw before she decided what it meant. She went back to the school teacher once more, in her 9th year, to ask about the pond specifically. The woman was slower now, a little diminished from their first meeting, but still sharp in the way some old people are sharp, not quick, but accurate. She told her that the pond had no name that her family used, that her grandfather had called it simply the still water, always in a tone that discouraged questions. She asked the ranger if the pond gave her any trouble. The ranger said she wanted to ask about the wildlife around it, whether the family had observed anything unusual. The woman looked at her steadily and said, "There's never been anything living at that water. Not in my grandfather's time and not in mine. Still, water draws things in, not things out." The ranger drove back to the district and opened her wildlife observation log for the section. She had maintained the log for 9 years at that point, noting every significant wildlife observation on her section. Species, location, behavior, date. She had 37 pages of observations. She searched for the pond location. There was not a single entry, not one wildlife observation at the pond in 9 years of weekly visits. She went back through every page, every entry, looking for the pond location marker she used, a simple coordinate notation she applied consistently to every observation, and it was not there. 37 pages of careful documentation covering her entire section, every spring and creek and gap and ridgeline, and the pond had not produced one observable wildlife event in 9 years. No waterfowl, no amphibians, no deer coming down to drink, no evidence of any animal using the water at the edge of the pond, no tracks in the mud at the water line on any of her visits. She sat with the log open on her kitchen table for a long time. She went back to the section the following week and walked down to the pond from the junction. It was a still October day, cold, the kind of day that brought animals to water in the afternoon hours. She sat at the edge of the pond for 45 minutes with her observation notebook open and a pen in her hand. The water was dark and smooth. No ripple from a fish, no frog calling from the shallows, no bird at the water's edge. The surrounding trees were full of the usual October activity. A woodpecker on a dead snag above the trail. A pair of nuthatches working down the bark of a maple. A white-throated sparrow calling from the undergrowth near the gate. The forest around the pond was alive with ordinary sound. The pond itself was silent. Nothing came to it. Nothing left it. The water did not move. She wrote in her observation log for the first time about the pond. The entry was 3 lines: date, location, observation, no wildlife activity, no tracks at water margin, water surface undisturbed. She noted the duration of her observation. She filed it and went home. That was her 10th year on the section. In her 11th year, she submitted the structural recommendation that led to the new register being installed on the junction post. She coordinated the installation herself. A simple mount on the post, a standard weatherproof box. She stocked it with a fresh register book and a pen on a cord, and noted the installation in the official log. She found herself reading the first entries in the new register more carefully than she would have read them in earlier years, looking for what people reported hearing, looking for which months the reports clustered in, noting the names of the hikers who mentioned the foundation site or the pond or anything near the junction. She applied for retirement in the spring of her 11th year. The paperwork was approved. She was assigned a final end date in late April. She spent the last weeks of her tenure walking her section methodically, as she always had, checking every marker in spring and register and gate. She wrote detailed handover notes for her replacement. 23 pages of practical information, trail conditions, seasonal maintenance priorities, relationships with local volunteers, the idiosyncrasies of the district radio system, the 3 landowners along the corridor who needed to be communicated with in specific ways. She was thorough. She was always thorough. 1 page she did not include. She wrote it and kept it. It was the page about the junction. On her last week, she drove to the section on a cold Tuesday in October, her final scheduled visit before she handed over the keys and the radio and the district vehicle. She parked at the upper trailhead and walked to the junction. She was not there to work. She had no clipboard, no damage log, no camera for trail documentation. She sat down on the edge of the concrete foundation in the cold afternoon light and looked at the pond below her. She was not waiting for the knocking. She knew it would not come in daylight. She had confirmed that pattern across 8 years of reports, always after midnight, never during the day, never in the full height of summer. She was not waiting for anything specific. She was sitting with the place the way you sit with something you are about to leave permanently, trying to understand its shape before you go. She looked at the pond for a long time. The water was dark and completely still. The light moved across it as clouds passed overhead, and the surface caught the light and gave it back unchanged, the way very deep, still water does. No rings from a rising fish, no movement at the margins, no sound from the water at all, while the ridge above her was audible with wind and birds and the ordinary percussion of a forest in October. She looked at the pond, and she thought about the schoolteacher's grandfather and his instruction, passed down through 3 generations of a family that had farmed this valley and knew the land the way people know land when they have lived adjacent to it long enough. The pond draws things and the hollow holds them. She thought about 37 pages of wildlife observation and the blank space where the pond should have been. She thought about the knocking that had not stopped when the shelter was removed. She thought about the voice on a phone recording in a truck with the windows up. She did not know what was at this junction. She had known that for years. What she knew now, sitting on the cold concrete in her last week, was that the not knowing had a shape to it. It was not the not knowing of insufficient data. It was not the not knowing of a question that could be resolved with more investigation. It was the not knowing of something that had been here before the trail and would be here after it, that had no interest in being understood, that simply occupied this hollow and this pond and this junction the way water occupied a low place, because the low place was where it collected, and it had always collected there, and there was no version of the map that did not include it. She stood up and brushed the concrete dust from her pants and walked back to the truck. She submitted the written account 2 years after retirement. She had moved to a different state by then, a coastal place, nothing like the mountains. A small house with a garden that she put her energy into the way she had once put it into the trail. She grew vegetables, she had a routine. People who knew her in the new place said she was steady and capable and good company. People who had known her in the old job said she seemed lighter, which they meant as a compliment. The document she submitted cross-referenced 11 years of official log entries against 11 years of personal log entries. The gap between the two grew with every passing year. By year 10, the personal log contained 3 times the material of the official one. Not because she had withheld dramatic events, but because the accumulation of small, unloggable observations had compounded across a decade into something substantial. A pattern of reports clustering in transitional months. A register from which pages had been removed. A pond with no wildlife in 11 years of observation. A shelter removed, and a knocking that continued from beneath concrete when the shelter was gone. A replacement ranger who had left the section after 1 season and would not say why. She noted all of this in the document plainly. At the end, before the conditions paragraph, she wrote, "I do not know what is at that junction. I know that it has been there longer than the trail. I know it does not leave. I know the pond has never had wildlife. And I know that my replacement was transferred out of that section after 1 season, and when I asked her why, she said she did not want to talk about it." The replacement had lasted 1 season. She had filed for reassignment in February of the year following her start date, in the middle of winter, before the hiking season had properly begun. Her reassignment request gave no specific reason. The district had approved it. Nobody had asked follow-up questions, which was itself a kind of answer. The retired ranger does not hike anymore. She has not been on a trail since she handed over the district vehicle. She says she sleeps well, and people who know her believe it, and it may even be true. But people who have visited her at the new house have noticed that she checks the windows before bed in a specific way. Not anxious, not dramatic, just methodical. The same quiet check on every window before she turns in, even in a neighborhood with streetlights and close neighbors and none of the conditions that would make such a check reasonable. She does not explain it. She does not deny doing it. It is simply part of how her evenings end now. The way certain habits formed in certain places do not leave when the person leaves. The junction post is still there. A metal post with no sign, marking the junction of the main AT and the closed fire road in a remote section of the North Carolina corridor. The new register that she arranged to have installed in her final year was replaced again in 2018, when the original weatherproof box showed signs of water intrusion. The replacement register has been in place since then and receives entries year-round: spring thru-hikers, summer section hikers, fall foliage walkers, the occasional winter camper. The register is active. She checked the entry data through a trail data service 3 months after her retirement. The service aggregated register entries from several AT sections and displayed them by month. She looked at the junction register data for the preceding 2 years. The numbers by month were what you would expect for a remote North Carolina section: higher in spring and fall, lower in the deep winter months, a moderate summer presence. Ordinary distribution, except for late October. The entry count for late October was significantly lower than every surrounding month. Lower than early October, lower than November, lower than any other 2-week period in the hiking year. No official explanation in the trail data. No note about trail closures or access issues during those weeks. Just a number, lower than it should be, in a database that most people would never look at closely enough to notice. She noticed it the first time she looked. The document was 4 pages. She sent it and has not written since. The organization that received it has not published it. The email that carried it had a blank subject line and no message in the body, and a return address that resolved to nothing. Just the attachment. Just 4 pages beginning with the sentence she had apparently needed 11 years and 2 years of retirement to be free to write. The junction is still there. The pond is still there. The concrete slab is still there, a flat gray rectangle in the woods below the unsigned post, convenient for a tent, a reasonable place to stop for the night in a section without many flat surfaces. The late October entry count in the register stays low. Every year, it is just a number in a database. Most people would not notice it. She noticed it the first time she looked, and she has not looked again.